What does every successful person have in common? It's something they've had since childhood. It's their curious mind. Curious minds experiment. Curious minds try and sometimes inevitably fail. Curious minds get back up and try again. Curious minds learn. Curious minds innovate. Curious minds change the world. From our generation to the next. Releaseworks. We empower curious minds.
Good morning and welcome to the first ever Releaseworks Curiosity to Growth virtual event. At Releaseworks, we believe that curiosity changes the world. We believe that the secret ingredient for every inventor and innovator is a curious mind. Hence, our mission at Releaseworks is to enable and empower curious minds with DevOps and cloud technology. In this episode, we'll be talking about productionizing your MVP or minimum viable product. We'll explore what is an MVP and how does an MVP differ from a live product. We'll talk about some of the things to consider when moving from an MVP to a live product and what are some of the pitfalls you may encounter when doing so. We'll be taking questions throughout. You'll see the address on the screen. It's workshop.release.works/ask. Without further ado, we will be dialing in Amos Halpin, who is a successful technology entrepreneur with a long career in building and growing technology companies. Amos is also the Chief Operating Officer of Releaseworks, so he has a lot of experience in what we're about to talk about. Excellent. Well, thank you very much for dialing in, Amos. Always a pleasure to chat with you. Considering it's our first ever Releaseworks virtual event, I was thinking let's spend a bit of time talking about your background and where you come from. I've been in technology for well over 20 years now, but whenever I speak with you, it feels like my numbers are rookie numbers, right? I need to pump up the numbers because you seem to be doing everything 2 times longer and 2 times better, right? So
just called getting old, mate. Yeah, that's it.
Exactly. So yeah, tell us a little about yourself.
Okay. Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here. Very happy to help and be involved. Subject very close to my heart. Quick potted history. Have to be quick. We don't have that long. My background is financial, but also I'm a detail person. I'm very much into business process. So I started back a long time ago looking at a subject called business process reengineering. That industry's changed a lot over time, but way back then it was about taking financial processes and redesigning them so that they were more efficient. Got into ERP, and on top of that, then got into software design and development on the basis of redesigning processes and turning them into code, which made them more efficient. From there, I ended up implementing networks so that we could run the software on. And that sounds a bit weird, but at that time, not many people had networks, but it introduced LANs and WANs, and then you started to become very familiar with how they were fitted together, the differences between them, and how telecoms started to implement and change the world. Then, of course, the internet took over. And then as soon as the web became a viable platform, I became very interested in building software that was deliverable via the web. And it didn't have a specific term or phrase associated with it at the time. But at the end of the 90s, it started to become managed services, which then morphed into SaaS. And I started one of the very first SaaS-based businesses in 1998. And that helped me float a public company in 2001. And since then, I've morphed upwards and sideways. So it's been many different mergers and acquisitions of different types of managed services and SaaS businesses. It's been startups from scratch. I've bought and sold organizations. I've even built data centers. But really for the last 14, 15 years this year, I've been working with different organizations to help them mainly avoid making some of the mistakes that I did when I was going through this process. And the landscape has changed significantly, but there are a few underlying fundamental facets of startup business design, software management, software implementation, and commercial management that are as true today as they were when I started doing it a very long time ago. And I'm not going to put a number of years on that.
Very good, excellent. Thank you, good stuff. So, the point of this series is very much around productionizing SaaS applications, right? What do you do when you've kind of got going with your SaaS product or service, and how do you kind of take it to the next level after you've typically got funded, right? And to kind of get going on that, it's worth talking about minimum viable products, or MVPs. So what's your take on an MVP? What does a good MVP look like?
Well, first of all, I think you need to buy into the philosophy of what an MVP is and why they exist in the first place. And there are a number of ways to look at them, but probably the easiest way to look at the whole MVP concept is around a methodology called Lean Startup. And I really, really like Lean Startup and the thought process behind it. It's not just applicable to software design and development, by the way. It's got a much broader usage profile. But MVP, if you look at MVP and the concept of Lean Startup, I love it. I really, really like it. Why? Because it de-risks the opportunity for your route to market and your product. If you don't know and you're not 100% clear, and let's face it, who is, what your potential consumer or your consumable marketplace wants from the product that you've got conceived, then you have to find a way to test this. You have to find a way to prove that there is a product market fit. This is something every investor wants to know. Can you describe it? Can you prove it? And MVP is a very, very good way of doing it. But the whole concept of MVP has morphed a little bit over the last 10 or 15 years. And I think people don't necessarily really understand what a true MVP is. And in my view, and feel free to challenge this, I think MVPs are very tactical. They're really designed, first and foremost, just to prove that market need and that fit. They are not, and were never designed to be the finished article for a go live product or anywhere near production. That doesn't mean that there are no components in them that will end up in production. That's not what I'm saying. But you've got two completely different mentalities and mindsets with an MVP. And I guess I'd probably describe that best by saying that the emphasis for an MVP is minimum. What is the minimum that you have to create feature functionality wise to prove to a market segment that you think it fits for, that your product or your service has what it takes to create a niche in the marketplace, or to disrupt a competitor, or to compete with competitors? That's all it needs to do. It doesn't need to do anything else. So, the general rule of thumb is that an MVP should take 6 weeks and no longer. If you're spending more than 6 weeks building an MVP, it's not an MVP, right? You've put far too much feature functionality in there, and you've made your life very difficult before we start. Makes sense.
Very good. So apart from spending less than 6 weeks building your MVP, what other qualities would you consider a good MVP to have?
I think the lateral thinking around MVP is very, very important. Again, if you think that this is a tactical thing, you're a small organization, you're a startup, you have absolute agility. You can do whatever you want. So the reason you're putting an MVP out into a market space is to get feedback. It is predominantly to get feedback. So the things that then come to mind are that you have carte blanche to be absolutely ruthless with the really small levels of feature functionality that you see. MVPs are supposed to be iterative. So it's not just one point into the market, get the feedback, and then it's binary, go or no go. It's a series of small iterations that give you more and different feedback that help you do things like pivoting. Well, what's a pivot? Well, you might put a product out to do one thing and find out that actually what your customer's feedback is giving you actually points you in a different direction. Well, why wouldn't you do that? Well, pivot it. And you can, because you haven't built a million functions that go in one different direction. You've built a small number that you can easily morph into something different. So you can be ruthless. And I would advise you to be super objective, really ruthless with it, and listen to that feedback closely and decide what you want to do with your MVP, almost on an iteration by iteration by iteration basis, including not going any further with it. The whole point about de-risking an MVP is that if your market says no, listen, right? Take it from there, roll it back, and maybe go do something different. So the whole point about being in a tactical mode with MVP is that you can be as agile as you want to be, iterative as you like to be, listen to the feedback, and also it makes no sense for you doing things like building over elaborate UIs or spending a lot of time building highly complex and sophisticated back-end architectures. They are not going to prove to your market whether it's a valuable thing or not. So you have to focus on the small, on the really clear ideas and objectives of what the MVP does, get that feedback, and then make really, really ruthless and objective decisions.
Makes sense. So what I'm hearing is that you should be ready to bin your MVP in a heartbeat if it seems like the market doesn't respond to it.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that if you spoke to a number, there are just as many organizations that fail. I would probably say more organizations that fail in the first 3 years in terms of startup world, particularly in the production world, or so the technology world, than the ones that actually succeed, let alone the ones that get valuable funding. And I think if some of those startup CEOs and teams spoke honestly to you, and you looked back and you had a critical eye over their MVP, if it was done correctly, about whether or not they should take it any further, as you get more and more experienced, and experienced teams have built multiple MVPs, you become a little bit more dispassionate about the outcome because it has to work, or what is the point? So people become very tied to their solutions, and they hate it when other people call their babies ugly, right? And I get it, I understand it, because it's your concept. You brought it, why wouldn't it be successful? Well, there are 100 reasons why it wouldn't be successful. Not all of them are inside of your control. So there are real reasons why you sometimes might need some external objectivity to maybe straighten you out a little bit. But also, once you've done it a few times yourself, you start to have that clear instinct and intuition to say, I can't morph this. I can't move it into or pivot it into something else. It's not really getting the traction I wanted. Maybe I should just draw a line here. And that is exactly the point of an MVP. You haven't spent 2 years and $2 million of shareholders' funds building something that actually nobody wants. You know now that maybe it's not needed. It's a sad world, but it's just the way that economics work. Your market either wants it or it doesn't. Take it or move on.
Yeah, makes sense. We've come across MVPs where the team has spent months and months building elaborate infrastructure solutions, Kubernetes clusters, building the most beautiful operability and observability suites, but they still call it the MVP, right? And they spend a lot of time kind of supporting what the future could look like if the MVP were a success. Right. Do you have any other examples of kind of what not to do in the scope of an MVP where MVPs can go wrong?
Yeah, I think that the timescale one, although it sounds simple, is the easiest measure of whether you're in MVP mode or whether you've strayed into full-blown software development, actually without a permit, right? Because your market hasn't told you whether they're actually going to buy what you want to deliver. And as you said before, if you talk about people that are building elaborate underlying sophisticated or not architectures beneath the surface, none of which your customer is going to see, how is that going to influence them that this is actually worth doing? So I think the first thing to take up there is that if you genuinely are spending more than 6 weeks building this MVP, you're not going to get what you want out of it. And spending any more time than that isn't going to give you a better result. It just genuinely isn't, right? I've seen, certainly in the medtech world, where I spent a lot of time, it's interesting. There's an inversely large proportion of investment funding available to these organizations, and they therefore take a much more convoluted approach to the creation of MVP than perhaps your average startup. So if you've got business, it's already got a product and then building an MVP inside an existing product set. This is where that stuff can sometimes get out of control because they already have full-blown teams that decide every dot needs to be, I needs to be dotted and T needs to be crossed before they can push it out to market. You lose that agility. When you lose that agility, you're already $1 million down the road in the investment before you actually putting anything out the door. And it has absolutely no greater chance of success. In fact, the risk is much higher now because you spent money. And again, looking at it in projects that I've seen, particularly in software and app development, there tends to be a view that you have to have a strong level of feature functionality, or today's tech savvy and digitally native people just aren't going to accept it because it's too soft or too weak, et cetera, et cetera. Well, you can be tactical. You don't even need to build an iOS or a Flutter app for Android. You can just build a web app and deploy it that way to get the concept across. But who are you aiming it at? Who's your test base? Who's going to review this for you? Who's going to give you that objective feedback? So I've seen it in all cases where it's very rare that people actually provide an MVP with not enough feature functionality. And in fact, I'm not sure that I've ever seen that, right? But in my case, the starting point is overkill. Takes too long, too much feature functionality, doesn't add the value, and if you like, disturbs the potential for the feedback that you're looking for.
Yeah, something I've seen, especially larger organizations do when they try and build an MVP for a new product, for a new service is that that there's a huge risk of scope creep within the MVP project itself. Right? When you start building something with the best intentions of keeping it in the 6 weeks, but at some point down the line, legal realizes, hey, by the way, we need to have this and this and this disclaimer in there. We need to sign this off. By the way, we can't put this UI out. It needs to go through our design department. There's suddenly a billion requirements on top of it, which kind of then takes the 6 weeks to 12, 18, 24 weeks and often beyond. Something that we've had good success with is kind of building a skunkworks type of function within a larger organization to shield them effectively from some of the I guess more enterprise
the pain of enterprise. Yeah.
Exactly. And that this typically gives a bit more freedom for the MVP team to actually do their thing, right, and get something out there to prove that it works or doesn't work. Do you have any visibility into models like this in organizations that you work with?
Yeah, I definitely do, and I love the skunkworks mentality. It's an American term that usually comes from the aeronautical and the aerospace industry, because for them to be able to get anywhere in terms of R&D, not only is it billions of dollars, but it needs to be completely separated from, let's say, the most complicated health and safety solutions in the world. And that doesn't mean that they don't take health and safety importantly. They do, but they have to be able to progress. And I think drawing a thick black line between rather production and R&D is something that's a really, really valuable thing to do. But it's horses for courses. So, for instance, if you're in the skunkworks side, the R&D side, you have a predetermined latitude to create MVP up to this point, and budget and capability and access to market. But you do not go beyond that. So in that role, MVP is only designed tactically to determine whether there is a value point achieved or not, and it never goes beyond that. And if it does, it's handed over into the production teams, who basically start again and take the concept of the MVP and ruggedize it for production design, which is exactly as it should be. But it gives them the latitude to be as agile as they can with a really clear mandate. And I think it's a really intelligent way to go. I've seen it work very, very well. And what becomes quite interesting is then that you get a movement of talent and skills and staff where some people love working in that environment, so they can work on small iterative pieces of work and then move on to the next one, and then move on to the next one. Other people just like working on longer term projects and feel better that way. But actually, it's a really nice place to be able to move your software development teams and your product teams and your UI UX people around, because it's a really good learning space for them to understand what feedback is like and how to move more agilely in a software development environment.
Very good. Very good. So let's say that we built our MVP in 6 weeks, right? And we've proven that there's an actual need for this on the market. We're getting users, we're getting paying users maybe on it. We're proving the points that we want to prove with our MVP. What's the next step then? What do you think? We should lean towards binning what we've built and rebuilding it in the right way, if you will, or evolving what we've built from an MVP perspective, or what's your thinking?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it is the tipping point between I would say production and tech debt, right? Because going down one route, going down both routes gives you production, but going down it in one particular way will absolutely categorically cause you a huge amount of tech debt further down the line. And by what I mean by that is that when you get to the point where you feel that your MVP has got enough traction for you to consider building out a proper product roadmap where you're building epics and stories in a backlog and starting to look at 2-week sprints in order to expand and functionalize the feedback and the UI UX journey that you can now clearly see building in front of you on the basis of feedback what customers are actually looking for. That's your watershed moment. That's your tipping point. That's the time to time out, because when you have that plan in place, or you have that structure, the point of that plan in place, I think you have to do two things. What you have to do is to build that backlog with the if you like, the professional engineering capabilities built into it. So if you were building it now from scratch, and let's say you didn't have an MVP in place, you would be looking at software development life cycles, you'd be looking at security, you'd be looking at scale, you'd be looking at the economics, you'd be looking at your cloud infrastructure, you'd be looking at quality assurance, all right? So all of those things are possible. But if you leave if you like, the threads or the stub of your MVP in place throughout that entire time, you're starting from the wrong starting point. You're building on top of something that is already not fit for purpose because it wasn't designed for this purpose. MVPs are tactical. Live running is strategic. And it's very, very difficult. In fact, I'd say you're going to be extremely lucky to have a strategic platform that happens to work even though you had a tactical MVP underneath it. The problem we find, though, is that people don't like the thought process of binning all the code that a customer is using and starting again from scratch. And my answer to that is, well, I don't think you really need to. If you think about the way that Lean Startup works and that MVP works, inherently, it's all around iterative update and iterative change. Agile development is entirely based on that with sprints, et cetera, et cetera. So my view on it is this. Take what you have from an MVP point of view and figure out, if you're developing that from a proper engineering perspective, what that needs to look at. And you'll find that every component inside your MVP needs to be remodeled or rebuilt or redesigned. So do that, but do that one component at a time and eat your MVP from the inside out. So over a series of iterations, you're replacing every single component that's inside that MVP with something that is now built on proper design principles, on proper SLDC, is secure, is scalable, in the right infrastructure at the right time. But you're not replacing the whole thing. You're replacing it one important technological piece at a time. Once you've done that, then typically the way today's certainly business-related apps are built, they are componentized as compared to being large single source code bases. So you now have a componentized infrastructure that is de-risked in itself. All of those components can iterate in their own cadence, in their own way, and in their own time, and you've de-risked the whole project. While, as far as your consumers are concerned, they're seeing what they tacitly believed was an MVP over time actually morphing into a production scale, and they're not feeling any pain. At the end of that process, you will have a production environment that is fit for purpose and safe, and you will have happy customers. And before you grow into something that has larger scale, hopefully you won't have any tech debt that will bring you down at some other point in time, and that you'll have to spend either your own funds or shareholders' funds rebuilding and explaining why you're rebuilding it, and using the phrase, building the plane while it's on fire in the air. It's not a place where any startup wants to be.
Indeed, very good, very good. Let's talk about that for a bit. So if you choose to ignore the technical depth that you've accrued throughout your MVP project, right, and you get the traction you're looking for, great. let's spend 200 grand on marketing. Let's take it to the skies. Whether it can fly or not, we'll fix it on the way. One of the things in that approach that I could imagine being an issue is security. Do you have any examples of security being a problem in scenarios like this?
Unfortunately, yes, I do. And without being, specific about where it happened, I think it was a real example of where accrued tech debt was tied, for instance, to previous versions of compilers that weren't fit for purpose for the project itself in production at all. So when we talk about being agile in MVP, I don't care what you write it in. Why could it possibly matter? Whether you use JavaScript, you can use assembler for all I care. What are you trying to prove? Do people want what they see and what we're trying to sell them? So when it comes to compilers, and again, how you're delivering, how this UI gets in front of the customer is irrelevant. But I've seen a situation where a hobbyist compiler was used to create an MVP. Guess what? That ended up in production. Guess what? It ended up, because the version of the compiler that was being used was 3-4 versions out of date, and it was using a version of Apache at the front end, which had security flaws in it. But they couldn't update Apache until they updated the compiler. But the compiler had taken such a pivot from one version to another, it was basically a full rewrite. And this was man years worth of work to get to the point where they could literally remove a very strong security flaw from the solution. The point is, for the MVP, it was perfect. But there's no way that compiler should have been used at a production level in terms of implementation, because you would never have opened yourself to that risk in the first place. All apart from the fact that it was difficult to get resources to write in that compiler, whereas there were others that was much easier to find resources in the marketplace to help them build and sustain the application. So simple things that maybe are not directly related to the environment that you're in, you can get tripped up really, really easily. Because again, you step back and say, if we're building a production environment today, would we use this compiler with this version, with this delivery mechanism? And the answer is absolutely not. Well, why are you doing it then? So they're really, really simple things. People just segue from one environment into the other, don't think about it until it's too late, and then you've got all kinds of issues and errors.
Makes sense. You mentioned scalability in there, and typically, if you go to market with an MVP, scalability tends to be an issue because it wasn't designed to scale, right? It was designed to support your initial use case. Do you have any examples of scalability becoming a blocker when not expected?
Yeah, very much so. And a lot of this goes back to your cloud infrastructure architectural choices. You don't really think about them when you're doing an MVP because they're not important. And I would agree, they're not important. But there's a point where they become very important. But there's also a point where they become extremely expensive as well as important if you're trying to retrofit a solution that has provided itself as a real challenge. So an example of this would be databases, particularly if you have a database to begin with for your MVP that is a series of tables inside the same database instance. That can be a real problem, not just for scale, but for security and for privacy and for any number of other reasons, none of which matter when you're doing an MVP. But when you then get into a point where you're looking at, let's say, providing something in a German market under certain GDPR rules where the data needs to physically be locally, even in a cloud store in that geolocation, then things start to become more difficult for you. Now, I'm not saying you necessarily need to plan for that in advance, but when you do need to look at in your database design, for instance, is where the databases need to sit. Which database you're going to use, which you may have flippantly chosen one for free to build the MVP, which you absolutely should do, but is it the right fit for purpose database solution that is parsed out the way it needs to be so it can be updated independently, so certain areas can be encrypted, certain areas can have more and different scale routes and different RAM and different CPU associations with it at a cloud computing level. So I've come across this in a number of situations. The database is usually the one that causes the most headache if you want to go back and re-engineer it later. And quite often it's never given enough detail in advance to flick out or even discuss what the architectural opportunities are. I've seen that cause massive problems and cost significant amounts of money. And it's borderline impossible to do an in situ database migration and upgrade without causing significant customer pain, because it's almost impossible to QA every end user use case scenario that will touch those databases post upgrade compared to pre. So it's a very, very painful place to be.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Let's talk about Teams a bit. Not the video conferencing solution, but Teams actually build software. Yeah. When typically you as a startup, you build an MVP with a very small team. It might be just yourself as a founder slash CEO slash CTO slash everything, right? What are some of the challenges that you've seen when you start to scale your team from one engineer to multiple engineers? Do you have any opinions on how to do that properly?
I think anybody watching this will probably have experienced the pain that we've all been through at some point in time, and a lot of it is about decision making and timing. You're right. When you're running a startup, everything about your business is tactical. It's not just the software design. It's tactical because you don't know where the money's going to come in from. You're not generating enough revenue to cover your costs in most cases. So you need to rob Peter to pay Paul and be extremely frugal. So whereas you might lie in bed at night thinking about the team that you're going to create over time, you wake up in the morning with the realization that you can't afford any of them right now. So you continue wearing those hats until you get to a point where literally you just about have enough free cash flow in order to be able to provide, let's say, the next person in the team. And it literally goes in iterations at a singular level, one at a time. So I would heavily recommend you focusing on the core competencies of your organization. So if everything about your product is about the look and feel in order to be able to compete with others in your marketplace, then you are a UI UX oriented organization, and that's the first person in the door. They're going to add the most value, irrespective of your previous skills in it. Because now, if you're running the business, you can only time slice and do some of that, right? Similarly, if your business is about transactional volume, or it's about accuracy and it's about scale, then you need somebody in the back end. You need an extremely capable senior software developer. And my point is, you can plan out your core competencies, the skills that you believe are absolutely most critical to you, whether you've got the money or not, and look at making those decisions in advance so that you can easily see when you get to that point of making that decision, it's a no-brainer, because you've not only described it, but you've had time to process it while you're waiting to be in a position to be able to do that. I think it's extremely valuable. The other thing to say about that is that you don't need to fill your team with all the members that would be in a typical team as full-time employees. Again, think about what is the most critical core competency to you in order to become a successful business. You evaluate those and you decide on what they are, and the common knowledge is you outsource everything else, because it is not as important. You can always buy in skill and quality if you need it, and it won't cost you as much, and it's not genuinely as important. So look at all of the other aspects, look through them, understand them, and make those decisions accordingly.
Very good, very good. Talking about the act of delivering software a bit, whether you have a team of one or two or whatever. What do you think about continuous integration and continuous delivery pipelines in the scope of MVP? Is it worth building CI/CD pipelines for an MVP?
For an MVP, no, I don't think so. For a number of reasons. I think immediately I would say that you might be building pipelines for a compiler that you won't end up using at a production level. All right, and the level of iteration and even the level of quality, and I say that with a caveat, but even the level of quality is not as important as getting it through and getting it out there, because the people who you're really providing this to will get it and understand it, and they can live with the odd bug or the odd bits and pieces, because again, this is a very tactical thing. However, the second you trip over that point where we talked about earlier, the tipping point into strategic software development, you need to start as you mean to go on. And the software development lifecycle has changed so much since I started first getting involved with software design and development. I think it is absolutely outstanding today in some of the things in terms of how you can de-risk your future releases and deployments. And to give you something anecdotal, where I've been involved in software projects and I've noticed them starting to go wrong, particularly from a tech debt point of view, it's at release point. One, you're seeing the cadence of releases too wide. They're not releasing every fortnight. They're even not releasing every month. It becomes 2 months or 3 months or 4. And what that means is that you are releasing such large packet and source code updates at that time. It's almost impossible to do QA on them. And the likelihood of failure is very high. That for me is old school, almost waterfall development. Even if you call it agile, it's not agile if you're delivering something every 3 or 4 months. And the whole point around how this is supposed to work now with these short scale iterations is that you can de-risk the delivery because there are minor components, small branches that you can release and QA very quickly, and more importantly, roll back with least risk if there is a problem. So from the point where you have tipped out of tactical into strategic, you must deploy SDLC with the greatest practice, which for me is continuous delivery and continuous integration. If you start with that mindset to begin with, you will never look back. It is extremely difficult to look at building those pipelines and to reverse engineer those into a living, breathing application that's maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 years old. It's very difficult to do. And in fact, I would go as far as to say, if that's how you're delivering it after 5 years, your development team isn't necessarily the one that will still be there after you do that, because they don't have that mindset right now. That's a hard thing to change and to implement and to get right. But trust me, there is absolutely no comparison in terms of the benefits of getting that piece right, and because everything flows through it. Your testing environments, your QA environments, your pre-development environments, your development environments, your ability to handle small incremental changes, hot fixes, everything. And guess what? It's not about the delivery of software. It's about customer satisfaction. This stuff needs to be seamless. It needs to be iterative. It needs to be real time. And your customers need to be able to see real benefits in what you're providing them. So that's what they're paying for. And you need to be able to do that without having to do a software update on a Friday night so your whole development team's got the whole weekend to fix the problems when they go wrong. If you're doing that, you're not really starting in the right place.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, been there, done that. Got the t-shirt. Right. Don't want a new one.
And the scars.
Indeed, very good. About observability, then being able to see how your application, how your platform is doing, being able to spot issues ideally before your customers do. Obviously, I think we're on the same page. This is not a huge priority when you're building an MVP, right? What do you think about kind of starting to build that observability into a live product then when we've gone over the hump of moving from tactical to strategic?
Yeah, it's absolutely critical, and it's another one of those components that you could ignore, but and you will get away with ignoring it for a period of time. But one of the great things about cloud-based platforms now, and the whole plethora of alerting and management and metric recording solutions out there, is that if you put them in from day one, you will become completely dependent upon them, I think quite rightly, and you will also set them up in such a way that the cadence of these metrics is aligned exactly to your system. So I'll give you an example. If you're an organization that deals highly in transactional volumes, and particularly if those transactional volumes are seasonal, you want to know that your scalable architecture, that if you're using AWS, for example, might be Elastic, is set up in a cadence that perfectly mimics what's going to happen for your seasonal variability. And even then, within seasonality, that seasonal variability might increase 3 or 4% year on year on year. Well, you can model that, but you also have alerts and you have metrics and monitoring inside your services that are looking for the telltale signs that this should be happening. This is what we call management by exception. And when you're dealing with what is starting to become a growing, self-building, self-fulfilling, autonomous platform with a cloud infrastructure that's scaling both up and down automatically with it, it's a fantastic thing to see. But you then, the human interface to that, is looking for the exceptions, looking for the things and getting out in front of the areas that could potentially cause you bottlenecks or problems or outlying edge use cases that might cause bugs or errors in your systems. They're the things you need to look out for, because again, they're the things that might cause customers pain, that might affect longer term revenue. So once you've built the autonomy of your architecture, this monitoring is absolutely invaluable so that you can always get out in front of the next potential problem. Because in my world, I don't know about yours, there's always another problem further down the road. You just have to have the time to solve it rather than reacting to it because you didn't bother either trapping or looking at the kind of metrics that could have solved it for you.
Very good. Very good. Amos, taking off your technology leader hat for a second and putting the technology investor hat that you have on your left-hand side on for a second. Let's say you had invested in a seed round to a technology startup, right? As you have, right? What are the things that you look for from a technical perspective? What are the things that you want your investment to fulfill after a certain time period?
Yeah, good question. I think first of all, because I'm a detailed person and I love tech, I'd only invest in it if I really thought that it moved the needle or made a difference inside either a new market or the marketplace that it was in. New markets, ironically, might sound easier, but they're more difficult to invest in because they're higher risk. You don't know if anybody's ever going to follow you into that marketplace. If they do, if they're going to do it better than you are, and yada yada, all kinds of other problems. But I think if for instance we're saying we're investing in a tech solution that's in an existing marketplace, which is typically the norm, what's the USP? What's different about this product? What is the product market fit, right? So if you're a startup looking for funding, I need you to be able to describe that to me in words of one syllable, and I need it to be compelling, and I need to know that you know what difference it makes and how your software over a period of time is going to do that. And depending on what round and what cycle you're in terms of the investment position, there is a clear use of funds that's going to get you from point A to point B. And it's usually an expectation that point B will require more funds, usually more second time around, to bring you from B to C. But B to C is an even bigger jump, all right? And in some cases, there are Series C, D, and E rounds and all kinds of other things that come along with it. But once you've been through that initial investment and that initial use case for use of funds, and you understand what they are, for me, then it is always requalifying the product market fit through sales and commercial activity. It's no good just being a software development team. Nobody's going to know about your product if it's a secret. So it is much about marketing and sales as it is about your ability to build good, high quality code that's fit for purpose in the marketplace that you're aiming it for. Those two things go hand in hand. So at the end of that same investment cycle, the things I would be looking at are, is the pipeline of sales and marketing where we expected it to be? Where's the product roadmap? How's the product roadmap morphed based upon usage and usability and customer feedback over that period of time? Where do we see it going now? And what impact is that going to have on the next round of funding and the next jump in terms of sales, revenue, marketing, and pipeline? If you get you work closely with the management teams that understand that those things are the important key performance indicators for the next round of investment, then you usually find that these are the things that they become eyeline aware. And we always know that in every organization, there are certain things that are outside of your control, market forces, economics, etc. But if you put those things aside because you can't control them, then if you perform on the other aspects of it and you bring it all together and it's all aligned, you've got a great chance at A, being successful, and B, raising the next round of funding on the basis of success with the previous round.
Very good. Very good. Excellent. So in terms of kind of starting to build the production live product after MVP, any other things to consider? After the hump, what are the main things to kind of get right once you've your MVP has done its thing?
There's I know we're biased, but I think it's really, really easy to ignore DevOps as a function in terms of what's important for scalability, and a raft of other threads that feed through it. But I have to say that, my experiences over the last 7 to 10 years is that integration between cloud services and the scalability of cloud services and the SDLC, that meeting point is DevOps. And you don't necessarily have to invest in it internally in a DevOps team. But I think actually outsourcing that until you have the ability to invest in it as a core competency is absolutely the way to go. And I think the more successful solutions and the more successful organizations have absolutely got an eye on where DevOps can support it and de-risk things like software releases and the whole QA feed point and all the pipelines that go along with it, and infrastructure as a code and the scalability of your cloud infrastructure. These things, again, it's ironic, but you can build up tech debt in your cloud infrastructure if you haven't deployed that correctly as well. And it's just as much pain for your end users to come back and re-engineer that later as it is to re-engineer software releases. So I would say genuinely, in no particular order, make sure you're using the right compilers. Please take a proper systematic look at your database architectures to look for the future there, and then tactically and strategically take a clear view of how DevOps can support your live and production running and what that actually means over the next 2 years. All right, that's what I would say.
Very good, thank you. One question from viewers is around a co-founder CTO. So I'm a co-founder CTO. I'm an engineer, a software engineer. We've now got funded. How do I move from an engineer CTO into a more strategic CTO, right?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, right? Because what you're doing now is you're starting to become less software oriented and more, let's say, corporate or business oriented. And these are skills, in some cases, you don't know whether you have or you don't until you're actually, they're staring you in the face with a requirement. So it's a learning curve for everybody. And I guess I would maybe describe this in a couple of ways. I would say there are organizations, and I'll be specific about tech organizations because it does apply to others, but specifically technical organizations, where I would describe them in 2 states. They're either technically led or sales led. What do I mean? If a company is very technically led, they're very technically oriented. They're very into the what's under the bonnet, right? They're very proud of that, and there's plenty of reason for them to be that way. But in many cases, lots of cases, they're not super successful because they aren't externally facing enough. They don't have a strong enough sales team. They don't have a strong enough investment in marketing as a proportion of their P&L, and therefore they remain somewhat of a secret. So all of their great technical skills are somewhat dissipated because they aren't externally facing enough. Conversely, you also have the sales-led organization that in some cases is gone too far the other way. They are selling vaporware. They're selling everything they can to keep their numbers up and to keep their margins up and to manage whatever they can in future. But actually, they're not investing enough in the technical background of everything to get it to where it needs to be. You'll understand that the happy medium is to be half and half, right? If you start with the technology itself, which is obviously where you have to start, you then need to, there's a fork in the road where you need to be as much about your commercial outlook as you need to be about your technological creation and productivity. And I think for many teams, this is where they struggle, right? Now, again, I come back to the concept of core competencies. What works for you? What do you need to have? What market are you in? And a lot of these answers will come from just looking at the environment that you find yourself in. But it's really clear that as you move from the, let's say the mechanic, right, actually to owning the garage and being a little bit more circumspect, you're going to need to learn new skills. But don't be afraid of that, because once you earn and understand the broader market space, trust me, you will feed a lot of that knowledge and intelligence back in to the software itself and the code and the product roadmap itself, because it starts to become self-fulfilling. So, you know, there are ways for you to manage this. If you've got investors, you can have some of those as NEDs on your board advisor team. Lean on them. Let them help you with their experience about how to bring these things to market and how to fill the gaps in your knowledge, and don't be afraid to ask for them. But again, I would come back to, if there are gaps in terms of sales, marketing, or other core competencies, try and fill those gaps. Don't just keep trying to expand your software development team. Get a broader auspices of skills and capabilities inside your team.
Very good. Another question. We have a product roadmap, a technical product roadmap of technical improvements to pay off technical debt. However, we are getting a lot of customer requests, which tend to overtake the technical improvements. What is the right balance between customer improvements and paying off technical debt?
Well, inside your own organization, that depends on who you ask, right? And also, you need a really clear definition of what technical debt actually is, because some software developers will see that anybody else's code is technical debt, and that's just not true. And in lots of cases, software developers love the opportunity to rewrite everything from scratch because it's easy. That is a commercial nightmare, right? So, you know, for me, if you have tech debt, and tech debt exists almost everywhere, it's impossible to remove it. But what you can do is control its size, and it's getting out of control. I think that typically speaking, as a rule of thumb, I would do one sprint in 4 that covers tech debt. But when I mean that, I'd run 2 separate backlogs. And that backlog for tech debt has got its own independent priority. It needs to be integrated into your product feature roadmap to make sure that you're not breaking the Venn diagram by doing something that's going to have a problem with any of the new code that you're delivering. So it requires proper project management. But what it means is that you're not forcing your team to always look backwards and introspectively. You're actually doing, you know, a reasonable portion of tech debt as you go along. Caveat to that, though, is that if you have serious tech debt, there is a point where you need to time out and solve it before you do anything else. And you have to be really, really clear about what that means and what it looks like and why it is what it is. Even to a root cause analysis, why did this become such a problem? What did we do wrong in our original architectural design that created this problem for us right now? It's really important that you do that. And it's not a blame thing. It's getting to the point of understanding why it happened so it doesn't happen again, right? But if that occurs, then you actually have to change the plan and put the sprints in to solve that tech debt before you move on, because it's counterproductive to do anything else. So to a certain extent, Miro, a lot of it is around strong project management and product ownership and understanding what is the right thing to do at a time. But it absolutely makes no sense in just filing the tech debt in the too hard tray and not giving it an outlet. And for me, the best outlet that I've found is to physically structure and plan it to come in X number of sprints, every X number of sprints to do. And then you're at least starting to get on top of it because you're doing it in priority order.
Very good. Very good. There's another question around do I need an MVP? I know there's a market. Do I need to build an MVP?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, to a certain extent, it depends on what the market is. If you know, and I mean know in inverted commas, well, my challenge to that would be, how do you know, right? What is it that you can say with all certainty that an MVP isn't going to qualify for you? And again, I'll come back to the point we said earlier. MVPs should be 6 weeks long maximum. And if that's the case, they don't have to be 6 weeks long. If you can do it in a day or you can do it in a week, well, then where's the risk for you to put an MVP out to prove what you believe you already know is true? So again, it comes back. It's a good question because it comes back to the whole lean startup MVP philosophy and mentality. If you have lowered the risk as low as possible, then doing an MVP is a no-brainer. There's no reason not to do it because doing it gives you feedback that is really, really valuable to you, even if it's not the feedback you expected. In fact, particularly if it's not the feedback you expected. So do I need an MVP? You don't, but I personally wouldn't risk spending any investment capital building anything without one, because I think you've maybe doubled or tripled the risk of doing it from that point of view.
Very good. That's brilliant. Thank you very much for your time, Amos. Amos, very insightful as always.
It's an absolute pleasure. Anytime, Miro.
What does every successful person have in common? It's something they've had since childhood. It's their curious mind. Curious minds experiment. Curious minds try and sometimes inevitably fail. Curious minds get back up and try again. Curious minds learn. Curious minds innovate. Curious minds change the world. From our generation to the next. Releaseworks. We empower curious minds.